As we're just waiting for our parents, some of our parents to come back from dropping their kids off. I wanted to say Happy Mother's Day. We honor our moms today. I'm just gonna be very honest. So singing The Potter's Hand is hard for me on Mother's Day because that song is the only song my mom and I sang together. Sorry, I'm probably a little bit ringy here, but that's the song the only time we ever sang together was that song at one of her friends' ordination. So come on, guys. No, I'm just joking. So it's a bit emotional and good, and one of the best things, right? So this is what Mother's Day is. This is what all these days are. They're both full of grief and both full of joy, and that is life, and that's what we celebrate at the Road. And I just want to say, whether you are a mother or a grandmother, or you are an auntie or a spiritual mother, any role you play that is nurturing and challenging and a safe place, you are a mothering person, and we honor the mothering of God that's done through you in our community. And so we say, bless you, moms and mothers here today. So I am a mom myself. I've got 2 kids. You may have noticed them. They are, I like the laugh I get. They are wonderful, always slightly dirty little girls who ask amazing questions, and they're a little bit sassy, which I actually kind of like, and I foster, I think, probably too much. But yeah, they're wonderful, and they're the best things I've done. But this journey of parenting and of motherhood, but of parenting is hard and good, but hard. I know it's a blessing to be able to have had 2 kids, but with the bearing of these kids comes some pretty intense anxiety sometimes. Anytime you're a mother, you will experience that. But something happens sometimes when you bear children, and there's this thing called postpartum depression that sometimes happens. And I definitely experienced that with my first. It's not uncommon, and thank God we can talk about it now, and we can get help, and we are not alone when we have to go through hard things like this. But I was remembering this week, this time when my oldest daughter was about 6 or 7 weeks old, and I was right in the thick of it. I was right in the middle of all those feelings and all that anxiety, just right at the surface. And there was this point, and she was crying, and she was inconsolable, and I could not get her to, it wasn't feeding, it wasn't a dirty diaper, it was nothing. She was just inconsolable in our arms. And I had to put her down for a second, and I went up the stairs to the washroom, and I put her in the pack and play in the living room. And as I was coming back down, after a few seconds of deep breathing, I was coming back down, and all of a sudden she stopped crying. And what had happened is there had been this little toy on the side of her pack and play, and she had somehow, as babies do with their arms, grabbed it with her hand, and it was stuck on her fingers. And she's all of a sudden just looking at it, staring at it, wondering what this thing has happened. And I was, first of all, I cried because, she stopped crying. And second, I cried because it was this really clear and beautiful moment, especially in her life. If you know her, this is the truth of her whole life. But she is happiest and she is content when she is learning something. And it was this moment where I saw, oh my gosh, she's obsessed, or she's really taken with this thing, and it's calmed her down, and she's focused, and she's looking at it and learning. And there was this moment where I realized, and I think it was a little bit of a God moment, where he was like, this is your kid. I see her, and I know her too, and this is what she is about. And that was a moment for me to just be able to step back and just wonder at her beauty, and wonder at, oh my gosh, look at this incredible creature who just is learning, and it's calming her down. It's making her happy. It is the thing she's been designed to do. And I'm telling you this story, one, because it's Mother's Day, but 2, it's a story about learning, and it clicks into that what we're talking about here at the Road, whereas Jesus, it's been Easter. We've been following the story through Scripture. It's been Easter, then there was the resurrection, and he's revealing himself to his followers, and now there's this big kind of now what moment for Jesus' followers. And they're being told, okay, now it's your turn. And that's what Jesus kind of keeps saying in all these kind of revealing moments with his friends after the resurrection. So we've been if you're just tracking with me a little bit, so we're talking about that. We're talking about learning, and I mentioned Evangeline's learning. So what I wanted to do this morning was kind of think about ways that humans are designed to learn. And the reason I want to do that is because the word disciple actually in Greek means learner. So every time you read in your scriptures, Jesus' disciples did this, Jesus' disciples did that, it's actually Jesus' learners did that, or Jesus' learners did that. So you could read it like Jesus' learners were amazed at what he did, or the Jesus learners were confused at what he did, or something like that. That's why we're talking about learning. So how do kids learn? How do humans learn? Not even just how they learn facts and knowledge, but what is kind of the underlying ways they learn. And we can look at like child development and really see some really cool things about how humans have been designed by God to learn how to be human. And we're going to pair those together with some stories about Jesus' followers after the resurrection, what Jesus is telling his followers to do. And then I'm going to braid in a few quotes from Jean Vanier, because that, like I said earlier, that is what his whole life was about, was following Jesus, being a Jesus learner, and doing that in real ways. And like I said, he did not do it in these grand ways. They turned out grand. He's known the world over. But he started just in his backyard, just right where he lived, being a Jesus learner. So that's what we're going to do this morning. Hopefully you'll find something, track with me a little bit, and find something that you can hold on to and take with you this week, as you are called to be a Jesus learner as well. Okay, so first of all, how do humans learn? There's a ton of research on how humans learn. You can get out your Google machine and type in, how do babies learn? And you'll come up with all sorts of things, from big research articles to really fluffy Huffington Post lists, and everything in between. But there's a few big ways that, as I was just kind of looking into this a bit, few big ways that research has shown that humans, babies, infants, toddlers learn. And I think that they're really instructive to our task today, which is talking about Jesus learning. So the first way that babies learn is by imitation. We've all seen this, right? You wave at a baby enough times and they eventually wave back and they get a big response and everybody's very excited by this wave and then they keep waving. But imitation is the key to human learning. So babies watch an adult use a specific part of their body. So I'm using my arm to reach and grab and touch a toy. And what research has found is that babies' brains, the part of their arm reaching out and grabbing a toy, even though they're not doing it, that part in their brain is lit up when they watch someone do it, which is fascinating. And so they call that neural empathy. They're building pathways in their own self to do something when they watch another person do that. Everything we know to do, we've learned by watching. So the watching and the doing is what teaches you to do something. First, by building a capacity in you to do it, not by someone telling you how to do it. Does that make sense? No one tells the baby exactly what to do. They take the baby's hands and this is how you walk. And they do these things, these touching, physical, imitating things. Now, to take that into Jesus' followers right after the resurrection. We know they learned by imitation. Exactly the same thing happens in them and in us. Jesus tells us to follow him because he knows that's how we learn. Not just learn facts, but learn how to be. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, my servant will be. That's in John 12. The Jesus learners who were with him had watched him do things, and new parts of their brain were getting opened up. New neural pathways were happening. And they were getting ready to live in a new way. And then they had the boldness to then try it. So it's worth noting, I think, that the content of Jesus' actions were good actions, right? Because it is possible to imitate not good actions. I think that's why we pay attention to how Jesus did things, the content of Jesus' words in his life, not just the words we say, but we believe, but we look at exactly how Jesus did things. When I watch Jesus, by reading or by looking around even in the community of believers or outside the community of believers, when I watch Jesus speak kindly to someone, What new way of acting in me is being fired up in my brain? Or when I watch Jesus tell stories and ask questions, kind of giving space for the listener to discover for themselves what new way of being is being worked in me. I was thinking about other things you see Jesus do, which is like going to the desert and being quiet. What does that do in us? How do we imitate that? Or stopping all the action around him to pay attention to one person. What does that do in us? At the end of John's Gospel is the series of really astonishingly gentle and beautiful stories about the disciples, the Jesus learners, encountering the risen Jesus. And one of them that stands out is the story of Peter. So we've heard of Peter. He's this headlong, kind of fearful guy, and his nature kind of led him to deny Jesus in the moment of Jesus' death. Say, I don't know him. And there was just shame about that. But after the resurrection, Jesus comes right up to him, and he reaches in and reinstates him as a leader. There's no criticism. There's nothing of that. He just reinstates him as a leader. And then he says, basically, do what I do. Feed my sheep. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. We know that Jesus calls himself the good shepherd, the one who will leave the 99 and go find the one who needs him. And he's saying to Peter, do what I do and feed my sheep. Jean Vanier wrote about this in his book. He has a really neat book reflecting on the Gospel of John. It's quite lovely. And he says in it that we are called to be like Jesus and to imitate him, to be a humble shepherd, not seeking power or wealth or our own glory, but to be servant leaders, ready to share our lives with the poor, to live simply with the poor, to serve Jesus who remains present in the daily ordinariness of our lives, and who calls us to become beloved. So a question we could ask is, what new ways would we learn to be human? What new ways are we learning to be a resurrection kind of human if we imitated Jesus? Kind of not afraid to try over and over again until we're reformed into something like him, like that good shepherd Jesus who goes outside the fold and finds and then brings back to restoration and wholeness. What would we learn about Jesus by imitating that in your real life? What would we learn what's possible if we imitated that in our real life? So that's imitating. Another way babies learn is by touch. Touching things helps humans, this is how we all learned, understand what words mean. So physical touch kind of gives context to the words, and it gives real life implications to the words. This is so basic, we kind of almost overlook it. But when a parent is telling a baby about something soft, they don't sit them down and tell them all the properties of softness and describe what soft feels like. They take the baby's hand and they touch something soft and they say, soft, soft. And in that way, the baby understands this word soft means something. It has a real word meaning, like a root into the earth. And conversely, so they've discovered that babies who are allowed to touch things, they learn faster, they learn deeper. Babies who kind of aren't allowed to touch things, they don't learn maybe as fast or as deeply. The words don't mean exactly the same things. Words don't get at the lived truth as much as touch or physical encounter does. And this is how Jesus learners are called to learn the word too, right? They are given something to touch. I think the biggest example of this is in the New Testament. It's called the Lord's Supper, or the Eucharist, or Holy Communion. And it kind of blows my mind to think about this deep wisdom of Christ giving us the Last Supper, because he didn't give us something to think about when he was gone, right? He didn't give us a worksheet with fill in the blanks to fill out. Not that worksheets are bad, but that's not how he gave what he gave to us to learn him. He gave us something to touch and encounter, something physical in the Last Supper. Barbara Brown Taylor is an author I love, and she writes that teaching in the language of the body, like Jesus did, is a pedagogy as old as the Gospels. Why else did Jesus spend his last night on earth teaching his disciples to wash feet and share supper? With all the conceptual truths at his disposal, he did not give them something to think about when he was gone. Instead, he gave them concrete things to do in their bodies that would go on teaching them what they needed to know when he was no longer physically around to teach them himself. So just like a child, any of the children you saw and heard earlier, just like they are learning the age-old truths of gravity and hot and cold and soft and sharp, and the truths of love and hunger and thirst, and what satisfies those things by touching, by experiencing it in their bodies. So we too learn Jesus by experiencing something in our bodies. Think about this for a second. Think about what the Lord's Supper could teach us. First, through our physical actions of doing it, and then we can kind of step back and analyze that and understand it. So if we regularly participate in the Lord's Supper, we are learning that brokenness is offered as the way to wholeness. That's what we're learning when we do that every time. We're learning that sharing food is what gives life to each other, right? We're learning that again. We're learning that making room at the table for everyone in this room to come to the table is kind of the call and the blessing that we're supposed to be about. We're learning that meaning happens, something deeper happens when we are together. And we're learning these things at a cellular, physical level, not just in the land of the mind. We're learning them in here. So the Jesus learners were given this meal before he died as a way to remember him and as a way to learn him. And then when we think about the story after the resurrection of the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, they were joined by a stranger, and he talked about some things about their scriptures, and he was kind of telling them, well, this is how it works. Maybe this is what this Jesus person was meant to do according to the scriptures. And these two friends of Jesus were interested, and they're like, yeah, that sounds about right. And they were intrigued, but it wasn't until the stranger shared a meal with them, broke bread and passed it to them, passed them the cupful of wine, that they physically encountered, and they knew that they encountered the truth of the resurrection Jesus. It was in the touching that they knew. And eating together was central, the central thing to the baby church. It was central to the worship. We're going to talk about that in the weeks to come. And they'd heard he is risen, but those words were given great meaning when they were then given bread to share with each other. That's where we learn about what this resurrection Jesus means. Jean Vanier wrote in another book called The Broken Body, he wrote, food is linked to love and to unity. That's what humans learn at a cellular level when they're in their mom's or dad's arms, right? That's what they learn, that food and love and togetherness are all linked. It's by love and unity that meals become a time of renewal and celebration. Jesus linked food and love in so intimate a way at his last meal when he gave his broken body as food and invited us to take and eat. So the question we could ask, us as Jesus learners, is what would we learn if our Jesus learning was not just about thinking something, but about doing something physical and doing that regularly over and over, like moving a muscle until that muscle is developed, doing something together over and over until that's formed in us? What kind of shape would our lives be formed into? How does touching this meal, like physically encountering it, get us closer to the truth of Jesus? Okay, so we have imitation is key. We have touch and physical encounter is key to learning. And the third way that humans, babies, learn how to be human and what it's like to be human is through surprise. Now, that kind of surprised me when I read that, but when you think about it, it makes sense. When someone is caught off guard, when expectations are sort of upended, a human learns more in that space of surprise. So they did this study at Johns Hopkins where they researched the role of surprise in infant toddler learning. So they took some babies, and there's a video of this. Oh, I should have got the link. I don't know where. I guess I could have put it up there. But if you're interested in watching the video, I will send you the link. But they took some babies and they put them in their high chairs, and then they had this little stage set up in front of them where, and it was kind of a blocked out stage where the person's arm could come in and it looked almost like a puppet show. So what they did first is they put a ball in the frame of view and it rolled and it hit a wall. And they did this a few times, and that's kind of what's expected when balls hit walls, right? You expect it to be stopped. But then they did a kind of optical illusion where they made it look like the ball was rolling and it went through the wall to the other side. And so that's a surprise. And the babies were like, whoa, what's happening? And they were fascinated. And then what they did for each of those sets of things was they gave them the baby a task to learn after it. So like putting something in something else. You know what babies like to do? They like to put things in boxes. So they gave the babies a little task to do. The ones who were given the task to do after they saw the ball hit the wall and stop, a regular expectation, they kind of, they figured it out eventually and just kind of normal. But the babies who saw something unexpected, they were then given a task and they learned how to do it faster, they were more efficient, and then they went further than the task. They would try to grab, those babies always wanted to grab the ball that was in this little scene, and then they wanted to test it out. They wanted to bang it. Why? Is it solid? They wanted to drop it. They wanted to see what was different about this ball. So these are maybe not infants, but 12 to 18-month-olds. So that's what we're picturing here. But they found that the element of surprise and upended expectations opened something up in humans. It opened something up in us that enables us to learn more, because I think we want to learn more. We want to know what is going on, what's happening. And it makes this space in our brains to wonder what else is possible, what else is going on. I emailed our resident neuropsychologist about this week too, Michael, and he said something similar. And I said, what do you think about these ideas? Is this true? And he's like, yes, surprise is an element in human development. He said when children were exposed to free jazz, so when notes don't do what you expect them to do, when there's all sorts of tonal differences in them, and when they're exposed to that, something often happens in their brains, and often the kids who are exposed to free jazz are able to then have perfect pitch after. So something has happened in their development. When exposed to something unexpected, something else happens, a new part of their brains opens up, and their bodies and their selves opens up. So it's just so interesting. You may have noticed, this is an aside, you may have noticed I have been spending a lot of time talking about science and our brains in a lot of my sermons. And I think that's just because I'm totally enamored with how we are made and how God uses how we are made to help us know him. So that's probably why I'm doing that. But I thought that was the coolest thing to discover. So let's bring this back to the Jesus learner. I actually can't think of a better model for understanding discipleship, understanding what it means to be a Jesus learner today. Because when we see something that upends our expectations about the world, we are open to something else happening. We are open to maybe something transforming in us. We want to know what it means for our lives, and maybe we will live differently. Just think about Jesus after the resurrection, literally the biggest surprise you could have. Take some time to imagine the hugeness of it. If you knew someone who had passed away, maybe just remember them. Imagine they've come back to life, and you see them. Automatically something has opened up in you, and you want to know what's going on. You want to know what's happening. You want to know why it's happening, and you would want to know what this means for your life now. There's this story in John 20 where after Jesus talks to Mary Magdalene, we talked about that on Easter, he appears to his friends, his learner friends, and he shows up right among them in a locked room. Surprise of surprises, right? This floors them. But this is actually the moment where everything kind of starts anew for them. How surprising that Jesus would appear in a locked room. How surprising that Jesus shows up even in our own locked rooms where we don't expect him and we don't expect life. What does that surprise do for us? Then I think about the lifetime of surprises that Jesus was. The way he touched outcasts and the way he touched lepers. Kind of like what Jean Vanier, this is a surprise in the mid-20th century to bring people in from the margins, right? What does that imply for this Jesus life? What about how he told really strange and really unexpected stories? Did that make the Jesus learners want to know more? What about how we don't have to live in guilt or in shame? That's a big surprise. What about even knowing that we are loved and we are seen, even in those darkest moments of our own lives? What does that do for us wanting to know what's going on in this life? What could go on in this resurrection life? Jean Vanier wrote of John 20 that of all the surprising things Jesus does, Jesus simply says, "Peace be with you." Jesus comes to his disciples and gives himself to them, revealing his forgiving love for each one. He does not criticize them. He does not judge them for their fears, for their moments of infidelity, of wavering, or of just not knowing, right? He does not make any critical remark to Peter. He does not make anyone feel guilty. Jesus confirms his choice of them. They are his beloved ones, and he is there for each of them, and at a level that is deeper than all that is wounded and all that is fearful in us. Jesus reveals that he loves and forgives us. We are unique and precious to him, and we are the beloved children of God, and that is surprising. It was then and it is now, because it upends all our expectations of how justice and of how consequences and of how karma and of how our culture even today still works. It upends that. There is no catch. There is no system. There's just learning Jesus. And this surprise empowers us to a new learning of what it means to be a resurrection human. And this is kind of the fun part, where you get to wonder what this Jesus learning would look like in your life right now. So what would that resurrection learning look like in your work? That kind of transformation, that surprisedness look like as you are, I don't know. I always said in your engineering work in my notes, and I was like, I actually have no idea what engineers do. So someone could tell me about that in your engineering. In your work, in your cubicle, if you work in a pod in a cubicle, what would a resurrection surprise look like in that pod with those people? In your piano practicing, in your curriculum writing, in your parenting, in your mothering, right? What would that resurrection surprise look like there? I'm loving this image of the baby who, in this video, if I send you the link, you'll see it. This baby takes this ball that is curious and doing something unexpected. It takes the ball and it slams it and shakes it on the table, trying to see what properties makes it act so unexpectedly. And I think that is the image of discipleship I want to offer to us. Take this surprising love for you, take God's surprising seeing of you, his love that walks through the valley of death with you, and bang it on the table and see what properties are there. Bang it on the table when you're at work. See what happens there while you're making dinner, while you're on a road trip. We can shut down the questioning. We always are able to when we're surprised by something, or when it maybe threatens us because it's such a surprise, it maybe threatens any sort of power or authority we already have. We can shut down that questioning, but I'm going to encourage us not to shut down that questioning, but to wonder what grace looks like wherever you are. So one real-world example from this, from a vocation of mine, which is in this season to be a mother to these littles. That day, I was talking about my oldest daughter in the pack and play. I had to leave the room, that sense of just failing everything, which is the worst sense in the world. I left the room, and when I was gone, she had discovered something new, and she was mesmerized. Something had calmed down right in her heart. And in that moment, I believe deeply God said to me, "Don't worry, I have her too. She's not just yours, she's also mine." And I've been testing that ball out ever since. I've been trusting that about how to walk with these kids through this life. I've been testing that ball out. Okay, she's not just yours. She's not just mine. You said she's yours. You know how she learns best. You know what she's doing. And I'm going to hold you to that. I'm testing out that resurrection life every time I'm parenting, every time I'm choosing to trust. I'm starting to be discipled into the way of Jesus. Discipled into letting go of my own faults and my own frailty, my own exhaustion. And I'm being discipled into an encounter and an enjoyment and a celebration of life, even with all of its fraughtness, even there, because that's where Jesus is. And I delight in her, and that's a good thing. I delight in the way she learns. So what if the discipleship call for us was to be surprised? What would that look like in your life, and what might start to be transformed in your heart? I think as I've been just thinking about discipleship and following Jesus, and just this word discipleship is literally probably the most churchy word we use. Like, you use it anywhere else other than in church and no one will know what you're talking about. But we want to take this discipleship and we want to standardize it, because that's what humans like to do. Or we tend to think that living a discipled life is harder than we can manage, or that there's an ideal that we have to get to, and we kind of have to like staple our lives to that ideal. But I really have come to learn, maybe come to encounter that relearning this life in this Jesus way. It's done way more like a baby learns, by imitating a good thing, trying it out, trying it over and over until we get it, by touching it maybe in our physical lives, this incarnated love of God, and then just by being absolutely gobsmacked by surprise, that it's not success or results or the goal of this discipleship thing. It's just being upended by grace and being surprised at our belovedness, right? The belovedness of every human we meet, and that's a big surprise. All right, I'm going to end there, and I'm going to pray. There's this one last quote of Jean Vanier's I love. It's not a great picture. That's at the Templeton when he received the Templeton Prize 3-4 years ago, and he brought all his friends, right? Jean Vanier writes, the call of a Jesus follower is to become the good news. Not just to talk about the good news, but to become the good news wherever you are. So I think I want to offer that as we close today, and as we wonder where we are in this Jesus learning life.